Betrayal often cuts deepest when it comes from those closest to you. What began as a harmless prank by my wife and her sister in the remote wilderness of Montana turned into something far darker than they ever imagined. They thought it would be funny to leave me stranded, powerless, and humiliated. But they didn't realize that in the silence of the wild, a man finds both his strength and his vengeance. What started as a cruel joke soon spiraled into a storm of reckoning, one that neither of them saw coming. The journey to Montana had been painted as a simple getaway, a chance to reconnect with family and embrace the untamed beauty of the wilderness. Ethan Carter, 32 years old, carried hope in his heart that maybe this trip would help mend the frayed threads between him and his wife, Rachel. Their marriage had been showing cracks, small fissures at first, but recently they had grown into something harder to ignore. Rachel's sister, Madison, often found herself in the middle of their disputes, fueling tensions with her sly remarks and sharp humor. Ethan had convinced himself that maybe this vacation would soften things, that laughter and shared memories would outweigh bitterness. As they packed into the SUV, driving through winding roads that seemed to cut deeper into Montana's remote heart, Ethan told himself that he could endure whatever discomfort the sisters stirred up if it meant saving what was left of his relationship. The first hours of the trip were quiet, almost too quiet. Rachel and Madison exchanged glances and whispers, their muffled laughter drifting into the back seat where Ethan sat lost in thought. He caught fragments of their giggles, the kind of laughter that made him feel like an outsider in his own marriage. He tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the scenery outside the window. Vast stretches of pine trees, rolling hills, and jagged peaks pierced the horizon. Montana's raw beauty was humbling, yet it carried an edge of menace, a reminder of how unforgiving nature could be. Ethan, however, welcomed the distraction, trying to let the silence of the forest drown out the doubts clawing at him. When they stopped at a secluded spot off the highway, the mood shifted. Rachel suggested they stretch their legs, and Madison eagerly supported the idea, her eyes glinting with mischief. Ethan stepped out, inhaling the crisp air, feeling the ground crunch beneath his boots. He was struck by how still it was, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird. As he looked around, he noticed how isolated they were. No passing cars, no cabins nearby, no signs of other travelers, just endless wilderness. Ethan voiced his concerns lightly, suggesting they not linger too long, but his words were brushed aside with casual dismissals. Rachel pulled a backpack from the trunk and tossed it toward Ethan with a teasing smile. "Why don't you check the trail out? We'll be right behind you." Her tone was playful, but there was something underneath it that felt rehearsed. Madison smirked, adding, "Yeah, go ahead, mountain man. Show us the way." Ethan hesitated, but obliged, slinging the bag over his shoulder and moving a few paces ahead. He figured it was their way of teasing him into leading, perhaps a small jab at his often serious nature. He told himself not to take it personally, but an unsettled feeling gnawed at the back of his mind. The further he walked, the more he noticed the absence of their footsteps behind him. He turned back, expecting to see Rachel and Madison following at a distance, but the path was empty. His pulse quickened as he scanned the trail, his calls echoing into the trees. "Rachel? Madison!" Silence. A sinking realization began to take hold. He retraced his steps quickly, heart thundering, only to find the spot where the SUV had been parked, now barren. The vehicle, and the two women inside it, were gone. Dust lingered in the air like a cruel reminder, the faint tire marks fading into the gravel road. At first, disbelief consumed him. He stood frozen, staring at the empty space, convinced it was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe they had driven just a short distance down the road, playing a small joke to rattle him. But as minutes stretched into longer spans and the sound of the engine never returned, denial gave way to a sharp pang of betrayal. They had left him there, deliberately, knowingly, in the middle of nowhere. A prank. That was what it had to be. But in a land this vast and unforgiving, such a prank teetered dangerously close to cruelty. Ethan dropped the backpack at his feet and crouched down, his breaths coming shallow as he tried to steady himself. He felt a storm of emotions boiling inside him. Confusion, humiliation, and the growing sting of anger. The laughter he had heard earlier in the car now echoed in his mind with a sharper, mocking edge. Every snicker and side glance made sense in hindsight. They had planned this. The two people he trusted most to stand beside him had turned him into the butt of their joke. In that moment, Ethan felt stripped bare, not just of comfort or safety, but of dignity itself. The wilderness around him seemed to close in, its silence no longer peaceful, but menacing. The towering trees stood like indifferent witnesses to his humiliation, their shadows stretching across the ground like claws. He picked up the backpack again, his fingers trembling as he unzipped it. Inside were a few essentials. Water, some. Snacks, a flashlight, but nowhere near enough for what he would need to survive if they did not return soon. That realization made his stomach knot tighter. How far would they take this? Hours? A night? Longer? The question rattled in his mind, feeding the unease until it grew into a quiet rage. Ethan stood again, scanning the horizon, the dirt road stretching endlessly in both directions. The SUV was gone, and with it, the last thread tying him to familiarity. He was alone in the vast, untamed wild of Montana, left behind as the punchline of a cruel game he never agreed to play. Deep down, something inside him began to stir, a seed of resolve that would only grow stronger with each passing hour of solitude. Ethan's initial shock gave way to a grim determination as the reality of his situation settled in. He was stranded, and no amount of denial would change that. The SUV was gone, the road was empty, and the towering trees pressed in around him like walls. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to panic. Panic would do nothing but consume his strength, and strength was all he had left. He took a long breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He had been left with a backpack, likely intentional, a cruel way of saying, "You'll be fine, it's just a joke." But Ethan knew enough about the wilderness to understand that nothing about this was fine. Montana was not a playground. It was a test of endurance, and they had placed him at its mercy. He began walking, following the road in the direction the SUV had gone. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, each step carrying the weight of uncertainty. Minutes stretched into hours, the sun sliding higher into the sky, baking the earth until the heat shimmered off the ground. He sipped sparingly from the water bottle, already calculating how long it would last him. He didn't know how far the nearest town might be, or if there even was one within walking distance. The more he walked, the more he realized the depth of the betrayal. Rachel and Madison hadn't just abandoned him. They had humiliated him, leaving him vulnerable and powerless in a place where survival demanded respect and caution. As the day wore on, his mind replayed their laughter in the car, their whispered conversations, the smug glances they thought he hadn't noticed. The prank had been premeditated, woven with intention. That realization twisted the knife deeper, transforming his humiliation into something sharper, darker. He wasn't just a victim of their joke. He was the target of their malice. They wanted to watch him struggle, to strip him of pride and dignity. The thought made his jaw tighten. If this was meant to break him, they would soon learn how wrong they were. The landscape around him was both breathtaking and merciless. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, and the road often disappeared around bends that revealed nothing but more endless wilderness. Occasionally he would stop and listen, hoping for the distant hum of an engine or signs of civilization, but the silence was absolute. A hawk circled overhead, its piercing cry echoing in the stillness, reminding him how small and exposed he truly was. His thirst grew stronger, his legs heavier, but still he pressed forward, fueled not just by the need to survive, but by the fire building inside him. By late afternoon, exhaustion had begun to gnaw at him. He sat on a fallen log, wiping sweat from his brow, and pulled out a snack from the backpack. As he chewed, he stared at the dirt road stretching before him and thought about Rachel's face. He remembered the way she used to look at him with love, with trust, in the early years of their marriage. Where had that gone? How had it turned into this? And Madison, her sister, always quick with a cutting remark. What role had she played in poisoning Rachel against him? These questions burned, but they also hardened him. If they thought they could reduce him to nothing, they would one day choke on their mistake. When night began to creep across the sky, Ethan's anxiety deepened. The wilderness was far less forgiving after dark. The chirp of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote reminded him of the predators that prowled unseen. He needed shelter, however crude, and he needed to conserve the little supplies he had. He found a small clearing near a cluster of rocks and set up what little he could, a makeshift place to rest. A fire sparked from dry twigs and the lighter he had thankfully carried. The flames cast dancing shadows across the trees, but instead of comfort, they reminded him of how vulnerable he was. Every crackle of a branch made his head snap up, eyes scanning the darkness. Lying awake beneath the indifferent stars, Ethan's thoughts spiraled. Rage mingled with humiliation, creating something volatile inside him. He wasn't just angry at being abandoned. He was furious at being underestimated, treated like a fool by the two people who should have been his allies. The memory of their laughter wasn't just a wound anymore. It was fuel. They wanted to watch him crumble, but instead they had lit a fire that would not burn out. In the silence of the Montana night, with the cold air cutting into his skin, Ethan promised himself that he would endure this. And when he returned, he would not be the same man they had left behind. He would be something far stronger, something they would never forget. The second morning in the Montana wilderness hit Ethan harder than the first. His body ached from the makeshift bed of rocks and pine needles, his throat raw from the chill of the night air. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the water ration was what worried him most. Every sip from the bottle felt like a gamble. Drink too much and risk running out, drink too little and risk collapse. Still, survival had become his only focus. He reminded himself over and over that he couldn't afford weakness. Rachel and Madison had left him to stumble, to panic, maybe even to fail. But he would not give them the satisfaction. As the sun climbed, Ethan pressed deeper into the forest, veering from the gravel road in search of food and perhaps another source of water. The dense trees towered above him, their branches swaying in a light breeze that carried both comfort and menace. He scouted for berries, roots, anything remotely edible, recalling bits of survival knowledge he had absorbed over the years. A cluster of dark berries caught his eye, but instinct held him back. Some could nourish him, others could poison him. He moved on, unwilling to take unnecessary risks this early. The wilderness demanded respect, and he knew recklessness would only hasten his downfall. By midday, fortune shifted slightly in his favor. Following the faint sound of trickling water, Ethan stumbled upon a narrow stream tucked between rocks. Relief washed over him as he knelt beside it, cupping his hands and drinking deeply. The icy water stung his throat but revived his weary muscles. For the first time since being left behind, a sense of control returned to him. He refilled his bottle, splashed water over his face, and sat quietly by the stream, letting the rhythm of nature calm his mind. For a fleeting moment, the rage simmering inside him softened, but only briefly. Because as he stared at his reflection in the rippling water, the reality of his situation returned with brutal clarity. He was alone, and the people responsible were his own wife and her sister. The image of Rachel's face lingered in his thoughts, not as the woman he had once loved, but as the person who had smirked while tossing him the backpack, fully aware of what was coming. Madison's laughter, sharp and biting, echoed in his mind like a ghost. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, until he felt a sting. Pain anchored him. Anger steadied him. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "They'll regret this." The forest didn't answer, but the weight of his words sank into him, fusing with the resolve hardening in his chest. The day stretched on as Ethan began to adapt. He constructed a crude spear from a branch, sharpening its edge with a rock he found near the stream. If he was going to last in this wilderness, He needed more than just water and scraps. He needed sustenance. Hours later, crouched by the stream, he jabbed into the shallow current with precision born of desperation. When he finally pulled out a small fish, wriggling in his grasp, a grim smile spread across his face. It wasn't much, but it was proof he could survive. As evening descended, Ethan built a sturdier fire than the night before, roasting the fish over the flames. The smell drifted upward, mingling with smoke that curled into the darkening sky. He ate slowly, every bite a reminder that he was adapting, evolving, refusing to crumble. The stars emerged one by one above the treetops, cold and watchful. He stared at them, his mind no longer weighed down by confusion but sharpened by clarity. Rachel and Madison had underestimated him. They thought the wilderness would swallow him, that he would break under the pressure of isolation. Instead, it was shaping him into something harder, something unrecognizable. The noises of the forest grew louder in the night, the rustle of unseen animals and the howl of distant predators making him grip his makeshift spear tightly. Fear was still there, how could it not be? But it no longer paralyzed him. It coexisted with his rage, fueling his determination to make it through the night and the next, no matter how many nights it took. He wasn't simply surviving anymore. He was preparing. Each hardship endured, each fear conquered, was another weapon forged in the fire of betrayal. As Ethan lay near the embers of his fire, staring into the shadows, he no longer felt like the abandoned man on the side of the road. He was something else now, something Rachel and Madison could never have predicted when they drove away laughing. They had left him to be a victim, but what they had truly done was awaken a side of him they would one day come to fear. The days in the Montana wilderness blurred together, each one carving Ethan into a sharper version of himself. His body grew leaner, tougher, his movements more deliberate. Where once he had been a man dependent on routine comforts, warm meals, soft beds, the structure of daily life, now he was a survivor sculpted by hunger, cold, and solitude. Every sunrise was another reminder that he had been left for dead, and every sunset was proof that he refused to give in. The humiliation that had burned inside him at first had transformed into something far more dangerous: resolve. Ethan had learned quickly how to live off the land. The stream became his lifeline, and fishing, once a desperate experiment, grew into a skill that sustained him. He foraged cautiously, testing berries in tiny amounts, learning through trial and error which ones his body could endure. He built stronger shelters, each night reinforcing the walls of branches and pine against the biting wind. His hands bore calluses, his clothes were torn, and his face was marked with scrapes and dirt, yet his eyes carried a new intensity. Survival was no longer just necessity, it was preparation. In the long stretches of silence, Ethan's mind never strayed far from Rachel and Madison. He pictured them laughing, perhaps bragging about their prank, convinced that he would stumble back defeated, humiliated, begging for an explanation. The thought hardened him. They had underestimated him once. They had mistaken his quiet nature for weakness, his patience for passivity. But the wilderness had stripped away all that softness, forging something colder in its place. Each passing day wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The death of the man they had mocked, and the birth of someone they would not recognize when he returned. One afternoon, as he followed a deer trail through the trees, Ethan stopped and crouched low, his spear at the ready. His senses had sharpened to a razor's edge. Every snap of a twig, every flutter of wings overhead pulled his attention. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was hunting. Though the deer slipped away before he could strike, he felt no frustration. He had been close, closer than he would have imagined just days ago. With more time, more patience, he knew he could succeed. The realization gave him a dangerous confidence. If he could hunt in the wilderness, he could hunt in civilization too, not for animals, but for the ones who had wronged him. At night, as the fire crackled and shadows stretched long across the trees, Ethan replayed every moment from the day they left him. Rachel's smirk, Madison's mocking tone, the sound of the SUV engine fading into the distance. Those memories had once felt like daggers, but now they were fuel, sharpening his focus. He spoke to himself in low whispers, promises carried only by the wind. "I'll make them see. I'll make them understand. The forest became his confidant, the stars his witnesses. Each whispered vow strengthened the storm brewing inside him. His reflection in the stream startled him one morning. The man staring back was gaunt, his beard rough and uneven, his eyes sunken but burning with intensity. He barely recognized himself. But beneath the dirt and exhaustion, he saw power, a kind of raw, primal strength that had never existed in him before. He realized then that Rachel and Madison hadn't simply abandoned him. They had created this version of him. They had unleashed something that could not be contained. A small, grim smile tugged at his lips as he splashed cold water on his face. Ethan began to think beyond survival. Each day that passed, he grew more certain that he wouldn't just stumble back into their lives as the butt of a cruel joke. No, he would return deliberately, calculated, prepared. Just as he had learned to stalk prey in the forest, he would learn to stalk the ones who had betrayed him. They thought the wilderness was their weapon against him, but in truth, it had become his training ground. It had stripped him down to the core and rebuilt him into something stronger, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. By the fourth week, the fear that had once gnawed at him in the dead of night was gone, replaced with a chilling calm. The howls of coyotes no longer rattled him, the rustling in the trees no longer sent his heart racing. He had adapted fully, blending into the rhythm of the land. And with that adaptation came clarity. He could survive here as long as he needed. He could endure far more than Rachel and Madison ever imagined. The joke they had played was no longer just betrayal. It was the spark that ignited his metamorphosis. Ethan Carter was no longer the man who had stepped out of that SUV with uncertainty in his heart. He was something else now, something forged in fire and silence. And when he finally emerged from Montana's wild expanse, Rachel and Madison would face not the man they had left behind, but the reckoning they had unknowingly created. Ethan's decision to leave the forest and make his way back toward civilization was not made lightly. Weeks of survival had given him clarity, but clarity also demanded action. He could not remain in the wilderness forever, not because he was incapable, but because his purpose stretched far beyond mere survival. His body had hardened, his instincts sharpened, and his spirit transformed into something unbreakable. Now, it was time to return to the world he had been cast out of, to the very people who had laughed as they drove away and left him to fend for himself. The road back would be long, but every step would carry him closer to the reckoning that had been building inside him since the moment the SUV disappeared into the dust. Leaving the stream that had sustained him felt like abandoning an ally. The familiar curve of the rocks, the steady flow of water, had become his anchor in solitude. But Ethan carried with him not just the memory of its comfort, but the strength it had given him. He slung his crude spear across his back, adjusted the backpack that had once been tossed at him as a joke, and began the trek toward the distant edge of wilderness. The mountains loomed behind him as he pressed forward, their jagged peaks watching him like silent judges. He didn't look back. The wilderness had been his crucible, and now the world beyond would be his battlefield. The first real sign of civilization came days later. A faint hum in the distance, growing steadily until it became the unmistakable sound of an engine. Ethan's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a sharpened sense of opportunity. He stepped onto the dirt road, his clothes ragged, his face weathered, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had endured far more than most could imagine. When the truck slowed and the driver, a rancher with weathered hands and kind eyes, rolled down the window, Ethan spoke little. He accepted the ride, answering questions with vague remarks about being lost, about a trip gone wrong. The man offered him food, which Ethan accepted with gratitude, but beneath the calm exterior, Ethan's thoughts were elsewhere. His silence was not born of weakness, but of calculation. By the time Ethan reached a nearby town, he was no longer just a stranded husband. He was a man with a mission. The familiar comforts of civilization, the glow of streetlights, the chatter of strangers, the smell of cooking food, felt foreign after weeks in the wild. He walked among people who had no idea of the battles he had fought, of the nights he had stared into the darkness with only fire and fury to keep him alive. But every glance in a store window, every shadow cast on the pavement, reminded him that Rachel and Madison were somewhere out there, living their lives as if their betrayal had no consequence. That thought hardened his resolve. He began asking questions discreetly, moving carefully, piecing together where they might be. His return could not be rushed. It had to be precise. Just as he had learned patience stalking fish in the stream, he would use patience here. He studied, he observed, and most of all, he waited. Every day spent in the wilderness had been a lesson in restraint, in timing, and now he would put those lessons to use. He would not burst into their lives in anger, giving them a chance to twist the story, to paint him as unstable. No, his revenge would unfold with the same precision the wilderness had demanded of him. In the quiet of his temporary room at a roadside inn, Ethan stared at himself in the mirror. The man reflected there was unrecognizable from the one Rachel and Madison had abandoned. His beard was thick, his skin weathered, his eyes dark with a simmering intensity. Yet beneath that hardened exterior lay a calm that unsettled even him. The wilderness had taught him not just how to survive, but how to control his rage, how to harness it until it became a tool instead of a weakness. He leaned closer to the mirror, whispering to the reflection the same vow he had whispered to the trees and the stars. They'll see me again. And when they do, it won't be as the man they left behind. Each step forward was guided not by desperation, but by purpose. He began to plan, drawing on the patience and adaptability that had carried him through the unforgiving Montana nights. Just as he had found water when his throat was parched, food when his stomach ached, and strength when his body faltered, he would now find the perfect moment to strike. Rachel and Madison believed their joke was over, a story to laugh about in private. But Ethan knew better. Their laughter had not ended anything, it had started something. And now, as he prepared to step back into their world, Ethan Carter carried with him the wilderness, the silence, and the fire. He was no longer the abandoned husband, no longer the man mocked by cruel laughter. He was something else entirely, a force shaped by betrayal, honed by survival, and driven by vengeance. The moment of return was nothing like Rachel or Madison could have imagined. They had settled back into their lives as though Montana had been nothing more than a fleeting adventure, a cruel joke they'd already forgotten. But for Ethan, every breath since that day had been a countdown. Every moment of hunger and cold had been a step toward this inevitable confrontation. When he finally stood before them again, he was not the same man they had left on the side of that empty road. He was leaner, harder, and his eyes carried the wilderness within them, an intensity that made their laughter die in their throats before it could even begin. Rachel's first reaction was disbelief. She blinked at him as though she had seen a ghost, her lips parting but no words forming. Madison, ever the quick-tongued instigator, tried to laugh it off, muttering something about how he looked like he'd just stepped out of a survival show. But Ethan didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't soften. The silence he brought with him was heavier than any words could be. It pressed into the room, suffocating, until even Madison's smirk faltered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. Where once they had mocked him, now they saw what their cruelty had created. A man sharpened by isolation, molded by rage, and armed with patience as lethal as any weapon. He spoke little, but every word was deliberate, carrying the weight of nights spent in firelit solitude, of promises whispered to the stars. He didn't need to scream for them to understand, they already did. Ethan's revenge wasn't chaos, it was calculation. Just as he had learned to stalk fish in the stream and endure the gnawing hunger of the wilderness, he approached his reckoning with precision. He revealed the truth of what they had done not just to him, but to themselves. He exposed their cruelty to others, turning their laughter into shame. Their reputations, once untouchable in their circle of friends and family, began to crumble under the weight of his quiet revelations. The prank they thought harmless was dragged into the light, no longer a private joke, but a stain that could never be erased. But humiliation alone wasn't enough. Ethan knew that. What he wanted was something deeper, for them to feel the helplessness he had felt. The raw edge of fear that comes when you realize you've been abandoned. He orchestrated moments that mirrored his own suffering, subtle reminders of the wilderness he had endured. A car that wouldn't start on a deserted road. A forgotten bag left behind on purpose. Doors locked when they thought they were safe inside. Nothing overt. Nothing they could easily pin on him, but enough to make them question, to make them feel watched, vulnerable, unsettled. Rachel, who had once carried herself with confidence, began to unravel first. The weight of guilt pressed into her every time she looked at Ethan, the silence between them louder than any argument they'd ever had. Madison tried to hold her ground, tried to laugh it off, but even she couldn't shake the gnawing unease of knowing the joke had turned into a nightmare. The tables had turned completely. Where once Ethan had been the victim, now they lived in the shadow of what he might do next. And that was the essence of his revenge. He didn't need to lash out violently or lose himself in rage. His power came from control, from the patience he had mastered under Montana's cold stars. He became the constant reminder of their betrayal, the embodiment of their cruelty reflected back at them. They had left him to be a punchline, but instead he became the reckoning they could never escape. In the end, Ethan Carter walked away not broken, but remade. He had faced the wilderness and won, faced betrayal and emerged stronger. Rachel and Madison were left to live with the consequences of their choices, their laughter silenced, their pride shattered. And though Ethan carried the scars of his ordeal, he also carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. The man they had abandoned in Montana had died there, and in his place had risen someone they would never again underestimate.